What's up, everybody? We're in the second week of our Is It Really Necessary in 2019 series. And the question for today is seminary really necessary in 2019? For those of you that don't know what seminary is, because the idea of this channel is that we can ask questions that people that don't like church or aren't familiar with church or think bad things about church, we can ask the questions that you're asking or maybe you'd be interested in. But maybe you don't even know what the word seminary means, which you probably shouldn't if you didn't grow up in church. So here's what seminary is. It's the place where we send people off to be trained in theology, that's like learning about God, and all these like counseling and different pastoral skills so that they can come back and become pastors in local churches. And so it's a great question to ask is it necessary? And here's maybe a reason we should ask it. One is because there seems to be sometimes a disconnect between people that go to seminary and come back and they're not able to connect with the people in their community. And then also it seems like there's sort of a shortage in some ways looking ahead as the baby boomers that are pastors start to retire of potentially pastors in our churches. So I want to tell you some things that I think are good about seminary and some things that maybe we should question and maybe we should think, are there other ways to do this? And I want you to know up front, if you went to seminary or if your pastor went to seminary, that's great. I'm not putting that down at all. That can be a really great thing. In fact, I'm getting ready to tell you why I think it is. So here's some good things about seminary. One is, it is not every church is equipped with a system and with people in place to train up and to educate and to get ready the next pastor for their church. So if you're in a church and you're not able to train up and get ready and prepare and teach the next pastor of your church, well, I guess there's two options. One is when the current leader of your church steps down, then you just shut the church down because there's nobody to lead. Because it takes leader. Every organization takes leadership, and churches take leadership. So that could happen. Or the other option is if you're not able to train the next pastor for your church and equip them to dig in deep on all the things they need to dig in deep on to lead a church, is that you just have to settle for somebody that's not quite ready. And in my opinion, I think every pastor in some way should be a theologian. Every pastor should not just be somebody that teaches and talks about things and leads, but every pastor should be able to dig in on the really hard questions and go deep on those. It doesn't mean you got to go deep on Sunday morning with people that are just coming in church, but the foundation for the practical things we talk about on Sunday morning comes from a place of really digging in on the tough things about who God is, about who Jesus is, about what as human beings, who we are, what do we believe about the Bible. I mean, those seem like simple questions, but each one of those questions can be argued in a good way, hopefully, and debated and just really wrestled with when you get down to the details for an unending amount of time. And that's the foundation that I think every pastor should have, this really deep, rich understanding, wrestling with God on these questions and wrestling with each other on these questions so that, we can go out and we can deliver the message. There's a saying that goes that for whatever kind of speech you want to deliver, you should understand the content 3 times as much as you want to be able to explain it. 3 times as deep, 3 times as much as you want to be able to communicate. So it's really important to have a deep theological understanding for all the things that underpin the story of the church, which is all about Jesus. But in some ways it's the simplest story ever, but in some ways it is the deepest, most complex, most sophisticated story ever. And so we need leaders that understand that. So there's a reason for seminaries that if maybe churches are unable to train their leaders. So we've got to have help from somewhere. So people can go to seminary, get trained, come back, and be equipped to lead the church. Another pro for seminaries is that it's a great place for the people that are the intellectual leaders of the Jesus movement to come together and physically be in one place. These are like professors and leaders and thought leaders to physically be in one place so that they can create a community of people that go deeper. And so that would be very difficult to do in a church. To have all the thought leaders from different, churches come together, the people that dig into the philosophy of what it means to be a Jesus follower and go super deep into the theology. Seminary provides a place that they can come together and this rich environment of digging into what it means to be a Jesus follower and all the things that go with that, all the big questions like why do good things happen, why do bad things happen to good people. And so it's a great place for them to get together. So there's some pros for seminary is that, man, if a church can't supply their own leaders, they need to be trained, not just called pastor. It's good to go deep in the stuff because it gives a foundation for all the things that are going to happen when you come back. And it's really cool because all the thought leaders in the Jesus movement, it's cool for them to have a place to get together and create this rich, deep theological environment so that we can move these deep ideas forward into the 21st century. So there's some pro reasons for seminary. Here's some cons. Here's some things against seminary. One is this. One is that the early church that changed the world in the book of Acts and did not have seminaries. What they did is they had, instead of sending people off to seminary and bringing them back, here was the model they had. They had an apprenticeship model. That means that a leader, let's say Paul, for example, the Apostle Paul would find somebody that they thought had the ability to lead, but they were young, they weren't quite ready. Let's say a guy named Timothy. And Paul would take Timothy with him, and they would spend time together. By time, they would basically live life together, and they would serve together, and they would preach together. And Paul would probably mostly preach early, and then as they had these discussions, and he sensed that Timothy really got it, and he had the gift of teaching. He probably let Timothy teach a little bit, and he apprenticed him, and he brought him along. And Timothy was able to watch Paul, and he was able to watch what happened when he preached and taught, but he was also able to see what happened behind the scenes. And so he was trained theologically by having conversations with Paul and the other leaders in the church. He was trained practically in teaching by being able to give those responsibilities a little bit at a time, probably from Paul. And he was also trained practically in this way, is that he was able to work with Paul day by day in the real life scenarios that come up, that experience is the greatest teacher. And it's hard to learn how to lead through adversity and lead through challenging times and lead through those moments when there's tension between grace and using discretion and just all these difficult things that come up leading churches. He was able to practically go through that with Paul. So there's an apprenticeship model. And when you go to seminary, sometimes it's like you just get the information and then you're told to come back, and it's like, hey, you're 25 years old, you just graduated from seminary, and I want you to lead 120 people ages 4 to 94, and here, good luck. That's really hard. So there's something sort of against the seminary model, is the early church used the apprenticeship model, and so I think it's a pretty good model. In fact, for my story, I was apprenticed by my father, and there was actually a few other pastors that, through conversations and stuff, and through just doing life together, they apprenticed me. And in addition to, I was able to, my father, I got to listen and preach for years, but also he just fed me books, deep theological books for years before I ever knew I was going to become a pastor. And there was sort of something in me that just wanted to dive into those things. And so I felt like I had I'm not putting seminary down, but it's at all. I don't want to claim to be smart, but in some ways I felt like I had a seminary level education in theology through conversations and through years worth of really good books, and now really good podcasts. And then he was able to hand it off to me slowly. I would preach every once in a while, and then he let me do more and more and more, and so I felt like I was ready, and I had practical leadership experience in a real church with real people. And the one other con, since we gave two pros for seminary, that churches, remember two pros, churches can't always train their own pastors, and seminaries provide a great breeding ground for intellectual discourse. So those are pros for seminaries. The first con against seminaries is the apprenticeship model was in the early church. The second one is this. I imagine it's really easy whenever you go to seminary, it's really easy, let's say you're there for 2, 3, whatever many years, to lose touch with what's really going on in people's lives. And you're there like just sort of secluded from the world and secluded from like what's happening in day-to-day lives. And so there's different paths that God gives to different people. And if you go to seminary, go and get trained up and learn. That's great. God's plan for me, I think, was not to go to seminary. And here's one of the reasons why. One is I had somebody to apprentice me. And two was this. I think that if I would have left my hometown to go to seminary, I possibly would have lost my burden for the average people in my hometown. So for me, this model of apprenticeship was the best. So that means there's a place for seminary, for sure. And if God's path for you, if you're called to lead in church, is to go to seminary and go get trained up, then go to seminary and go get trained up. If God's plan for you is one day become a leader, a professor, somebody that's going to challenge and encourage the next generation of believers at seminaries, then go be that person. If God's plan for you is to stay in the local church and be apprenticed by somebody, and then if you're going to do that, let me give you a hint. You better read and you better listen to every great podcast you can and get the best education you possibly can, because you have the ability to do that in 2019 like you have never had before. So get trained up. Go deep in the good news of Jesus. Dig deep into theology. Dig deep into leadership so that you'll be prepared. But there's lots of different paths, but I know this. I'll leave with this. God can raise up leaders how he wants, and he will use seminary sometimes, and he will use the local church and the apprenticeship model sometimes. But the main thing is that we say yes to whatever it is that God's leading us to do, because he'll have you prepared for what he's leading you to. I promise he can prepare you 1,000 different ways. God's so big that he can get you ready through seminary or through your home church or through something else. Y'all, we'll see you next week. We've got more Is It Really Necessary in 2019 on the way.